Hello, everyone, and welcome to our program today, Multilingual Jewish Prayer Throughout History, Performance, and Analysis. We have a wonderful program scheduled today. I'm Mark Kligman, Director of the Lowell Milken Center for Music of American Jewish Experience at the UCLA Herb Alpert School of Music. We want to thank the sponsors for today's event, which includes the Open Siddur Project, the Jewish Language Project, and our center, the Lowell Milken Center for Music of American Jewish Experience. To begin today's program, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Sarah Bunin-Ben-Or from Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, who runs the Jewish Language Project. Sarah, we look forward to your introduction.
Thank you so much, Mark, and welcome everybody. We're very happy that you've joined us today. Last year, the Milken Center and the Jewish Language Project ran together a series of concerts and lectures by Asher Shasho Levi on this topic of prayer in many Jewish languages. And these events were very popular and there were many remaining questions. So we decided to bring in some additional experts. And in case you didn't attend those events last year, don't worry, we're gonna begin this event today with Asher giving a few examples of those performances and focusing primarily on Ladino and also on Judeo-Arabic. And then the panelists will explain how this phenomenon of multilingual Jewish prayer came about and how it has appeared in other times and places throughout history. So I'm going to introduce each panelist. First, I'm going to start with Asher. Asher Shasho Levi is a multi-instrumentalist, chazan, educator, scholar of Sephardic tradition, and the leader of the Aram Soba Ensemble, a group dedicated to the musical heritage of Syrian Jewry, where his paternal family originates. He has served as artist in residence at Valley Beth Shalom Synagogue, artist and researcher in residence at the HUC Jewish Language Project, and beginning in July, he will be assuming the role of chazan and musical director of The Kitchen in San Francisco. Mazel tov on that, Asher. And Asher, please present your music.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Mark. What a joy to be here with this panel and to be presenting this this liturgy and this music that is so close to my heart. So what I'm going to be doing, over the past year, these lectures that I've given on Jewish vernacular liturgy, there's so much information that I presented. But what I want to do today is really focus just on the music. So I'm going to play different selections of vernacular Jewish liturgy, of prayers, of pieces of sacred poetry and music that might not necessarily be part of the prayer service. So for example, piyutim, bakashot, pizmonim, etc., from different primarily Ottoman Jewish repertoires and primarily early modern. So I'm going to begin with the Judeo-Spanish version of Yaribon Alam from Israel Najara, that great Sephardic poet of the 16th century, who really is, we consider him to be the founder of our pizmonim tradition because he wrote these beautiful pieces of poetry and then set them to Arabic and Turkish maqam. So this melody for Ya Señor del Mundo, Yaribon Alam, comes from Turkey, and it is in maqam ushak, according to the Turkish system. Ya Señor del mundo, y siempre, ya Señor del mundo, y siempre, tú el rey de los reyes, tú el rey de los reyes, hechas de tus baraganías y maravillas, hechas de tus baraganías y maravillas, mi placer a mí por reconocer contarlas place a mí por contarlas. So this is an example of a calqued translation, basically, what you would call en ladinar, where the words of the Hebrew poetry are translated basically word for word in a way that in some ways would become clumsy in the more modern era. So by the 20th century, some of these very literal translations from the 16th, 17th, 18th century were being phased out in favor of more modern Ladino renditions. And so probably the most notable of those 20th century Ladino translations would be those of the Selichot, in which you have basically, and it's unique among the Sephardic and Middle Eastern Jewish communities, where you have the Selichot completely translated into another language. So I'll be bringing some examples from the Judeo-Arabic communities, primarily Levantine, Syrian, Lebanese, those sort of communities, where there is vernacular liturgy, but it's not really included in the synagogue service. It's in these sort of liminal spaces in the liturgy, be it the singing of Pizmonim around the Shabbat table, or Havdalah, or something like that. But in the Judeo-Spanish liturgy, it is very, very central. And so I'm going to present just a couple pieces that give a feeling for this. And these are the translations from Rhodes, from Rabbi Israel in the early 20th century. I'll start with the end, actually. I'll start with El Nora Alila of Yom Kippur. Oh Dio grande y poderoso, ensalzado y temeroso, codranos tu perdón en hora de Neila, el Nora Alila, el Nora Alila, amsilanu mechila, bishatane. And I'll go back a little bit in the liturgy towards the mincha of Yom Kippur with the beautiful, beautiful piyut Yashema Ebyonecha. This is a melody that you'll hear commonly in Sephardic communities of multiple different origins, but this beautiful version from the Rhodes community has this gorgeous Ladino, again from Rabbi Reuven Eliyahu Yisrael, who composed this in the early 20th century. Oye Dio y tu menesterosos quiero a ti, ansiosos son tus hijos querenciosos, no sean abandonados de ti. Ya Shema Evyonecha, Am Halim Panecha, Avinu Levanecha, Al Talem Oznecha. So the words move from that En Ladinar, that calqued translation, to the refrain. Many of these pieces were written to allow for people to sing the familiar melodies that they know, knew, and loved. And so it ties everything together. It allows for more communal singing. It allows for people to understand what is being said, and a wide group of people, those who would not be as formally religiously educated, children, women, and it would give everyone a stake in the tefillah. So I'm going to move now to some examples from the Judeo-Arabic traditions. As I mentioned, there is not as much of this liturgy, regardless of what Judeo-Arabic tradition we're speaking of. Certain communities may have more than others. The Iraqi community has quite a lot. Yemenite communities have quite a lot of liturgy. These are not my areas of expertise, though. I focus primarily on Syrian, and in our Syrian community, the main places that you're going to find these liturgies are going to be at home. So Havdalah, around the Shabbat table, primarily at Pesach. At Pesach is really where a lot of this comes out, with most of the Haggadah done in a sort of interlinear manner between the Hebrew Aramaic and the Judeo-Arabic. And this is also common in the Ladino-speaking communities where this is done in Spanish. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to end with just a couple examples in Judeo-Arabic. One of them is the Shabbat song Habib Allah Eliyahu, which basically goes through the stages of Eliyahu's journey and places him in the context of the community. So it shows him going into Syria and to certain places and his travels up to as far as Istanbul. So it places this biblical figure in the context of basically the communal memory. But I'm going to start with a little bit of the Pesach songs. Min ya'lamu min yadri and Wahajidi. So that's Ehad Miodea and Chad Gadya. من يعلم ومن يدري ألا رب المتجالي إيدوي الواحد واحد يالي خلنا الله الله لا إله إلا هو. Now to the last verse. من يعلم ومن يدري ألا رب المتجالي إيدا حنين تلاتش البر مصفى تناش بتي إسرائيل 11 كوكب بالسماء 10 كلمة إيتورا 9 إشعر الحبلة 8 إيم الميلة 7 إيم الحبة 6 صدادر المشنة 5 مساحة في تورا 4 إماتنا و3 ياباتنا 2 مسوار 1 يالي خلنا الله الله لا إله إلا هو واحد جدي واحد جدي واحد جدي واحد جدي إلا دي اشترى لي أبي بمصرية ويجات المقدس مبارك هو واخد ملخ الموت إلا دي ياخد روح دبخ إلا دي دبح يدور إلا دي شرب الماء إلا دي طافت النار إلا دي حرد الصاية إلا دي ضربت الكلب إلا دي آدي القطة إلا دي أكلت الجدي إلا دي اشترى لي أبي بمصريتين واحد جدي واحد جدي. And to finish up, just a little bit of Habib Allah Eliyahu, that beautiful Shabbat song that is sung in Syrian, Lebanese, Egyptian, Iraqi communities, each of our communities fighting over who wrote it. The Syrian community says it's very old and traditional. The Iraqi community says it was written by Yosef Chaim, the Ben Ish Chai, which can't be right, but it's very possible that he added stanzas because there is a long tradition in our communities of there being sort of a source piyut that then has stanzas added to it. In particular, in Judeo-Arabic, there's a great example of that in the Iraqi community with the piyut by Najara Surigo Aliyah, and there are tons and tons of verses that were added to it in Arabic to commemorate moments of ziyara, which is a visitation to basically graves of Sadiqim or of prophets. So I'm going to finish my section of this panel with a little bit of Habib Allah Eliyahu, that Eliyahu is beloved of God and is close to God. حبيب الله إلياو عزيز الله إلياو بن حسب الأزار يتصمى يا رادي الغتصاب من آلهما الضل كذبي وزمري رمى وغار على السمر بهو حبيب الله إلياهو عزيز الله إلياهو حبيب الله إلياهو عزيز الله إلياهو.
Okay, thank you so much, Asher. That was beautiful.
Thank you, Sarah.
And now we're going to get a little bit of background about how this tradition came about. How did Jews start translating prayers into other languages? So first, I'm going to introduce Ruth Langer. Ruth Langer is professor of Jewish studies in the theology department at Boston College. Her research focuses on the history of Jewish liturgy, and on Christian-Jewish relations, sometimes combined. So Ruth, I'm going to ask you to tell us a little bit about the history of Jewish prayer. Today, most Jews pray in Hebrew. So when were those prayers written and when were they first widely used? In those periods, was Hebrew the vernacular when those prayers were first widely used? And when did Jews first start reciting prayers in Aramaic, which was the next vernacular, and in other languages? And what are the halachic discourses surrounding prayers in the vernacular? And I know those are a lot of questions. I'm going to ask you to try to respond as well as you can on one foot in about 5 minutes.
Okay, I will literally stand on one foot. No, so the question is, when did Jews start writing prayers? And that's itself already an issue. So of course there are written prayers in Hebrew from the Bible, but not much in the way of communal prayers except for psalms and things like that that were recited in the temple. We know that the people of the community of the Dead Sea Scrolls wrote prayers, and they had prayers that were in Hebrew. But we don't know a lot about the performance of those prayers and who was involved in the nature of the community and what spoke to the language of prayers, other than the fact that we do know that in the Second Temple period, the use of biblical models was very, very important in terms of generating prayers. People knew their Bible well enough that they could use its language to generate their own prayers. Now that's most people. Our question here is, though, about vernacular prayer. What were Jews actually speaking in that world? We know that there were lots of Jews whose active language was Greek, and there were lots of Jews whose active language was Aramaic. Hebrew, we're not quite sure to what extent it was a language of learning versus a language of active daily use. That's a bigger question that's not so easy to resolve. But so when the rabbis started generating prayers, they seem to have had a very strong preference for Hebrew prayer for themselves at the very least. And it's a huge dispute that I'm in the midst of, whether they actually composed these prayers or whether they knew the kind of language that people would use and handed their world a group of themes that they could more freely compose prayer texts to and for. But they do seem to have a concern in the corners for people for whom Hebrew was not the language of their prayers. And some of these, we have some evidence that they were Aramaic speakers. The Talmud tells us about somebody who, instead of saying Hamotzi lechem min haaretz over his bread, said, "Blessed be the master of this piece of bread," and said that in Aramaic. The Mishnah already tells us that Elun emrim b'kol lashon, that these certain prayers, and then they name the central prayers of rabbinic liturgy, can be said in any language. But then later generations step back from that and say, really? Isn't it better to say them in Hebrew? And they have arguments about whether it's better to say them in Hebrew or better to understand one's prayers. And so the permission for Aramaic prayer, for Greek prayer, it's really not specific to those languages. To prayer in any other language is the idea that people need to understand what they are saying. And therefore, for people, those lesser people, and there is sort of that tone implied, who can't manage Hebrew, well, then they can manage other prayers. Now, in Babylonia, they seem to have stepped back from that even further. The Babylonian Talmud says, well, don't really expect to reach God as effectively if you pray in another language, especially in the vernacular in Babylonia, which was Aramaic, because, well, the angels don't understand Aramaic, and so they can't help your prayers get to God. And so there's a sense that certain prayers better be said in the language that the angels do know, which is Hebrew. And this leads to this preference, this elitist preference, winning out in many ways on the official prayers of the Jews. And of course, by the time we get to written prayers, which is really around the year 1000 plus or minus, with what we know from the Cairo Geniza, the vast majority of the prayers that are there and the official prayers are in Hebrew, some poetry in Aramaic. But the vast majority of the prayers, and certainly the central statutory, the official required prayers are in Hebrew, with exceptions around the corners like Kaddish. That's on one foot.
Okay, thank you. That was really a lot packed in there, very informative. So now we're going to move forward in history to Renaissance Italy. Now I know it's a big jump, right? So we were supposed to have Michael Rizek here, but he had a family obligation and couldn't join us today. So he sent his remarks in advance. Michael Rizek is professor of medieval Hebrew and Judeo-Italian and head of the Department of Hebrew and Semitic Languages at Bar-Ilan University. So I asked him these questions, and here are his answers. First, when did Jews start writing prayers in Judeo-Italian? And his answer is, we don't really know. The earliest manuscripts that we have are from the 15th century, but according to the lexicon and the dialectal features, it's clear that the tradition of translation is much older than the 15th century, and that it originated from a place that was farther to the south than where they were than where those documents were written. My next question was, were those prayers exact translations of original Hebrew prayers? And his answer was yes. You can see this by comparing it to the Hebrew texts. And Asher talked before about how it was a calque translation in Ladino. And you have some of that in this case in Judeo-Italian, but also some differences. So he says the Amidah blessings in Judeo-Italian, Ladino, and Judeo-Provençal are very similar in many aspects because it's translating the same prayer. And these three languages are also historically connected. So it's interesting to compare how they translate the blessings. Generally, it may be said that all three traditions of translations are literal, according to the medieval Volgarizamenti tradition. I'm sorry for the noise. There's a gardener next door. But the Judeo-Italian translation is much closer to what can be called normative Judeo-Italian, whereas the Ladino one is more word for word, trying to imitate the Hebrew word order. And so let's see, also the Judeo-Italian translations have more Hebrew words in them, which is really interesting because it's following the living tradition of their language, how they spoke more than the Ladino version. And Michael is actually working on an article about that right now. Another thing that we can see is that there are some prayers that were written in Judeo-Italian and then translated into Hebrew and remain in some more recent Sidurim. Misheberach, Zichron Nefashot, and Hatarat Klalot. And there's also Tefillah Yafa for the women in Judeo-Italian, and that prayer is only in some of these manuscripts. So then I asked, who recited these prayers? Were they for women or anyone? And his answer was, officially these translations were written for women. The translations, this is clear from the first page with the morning benedictions, and it has the characteristic versions for women. So the benediction, She'asani lirtsono, that God made me according to his will, instead of Shelo asani isha, which is God has not made me a woman. That's the male version. And so here are the versions of She'asani lirtsono in Judeo-Italian. And I'm sorry for my pronunciation. Benedetto tu domedet det nostro re dello olam che fece me come la volonta sua. Blessed are you, our God, King of the universe, that made me according to his wish. And you have similar ones in the benediction for that has not made me a slave. The word is shifcha. It's a Hebrew word in Judeo-Italian, and also skiava in other manuscripts. And also the benediction that has not made me a goy, a non-Jew. It uses the feminine version goya, and also the positive version, qual creo me Yehudit, who made me Jewish, instead of who did not make me non-Jew. And also there are the Mishnaic texts that are normally in Sidurim are absent from the 15th century manuscripts because it was forbidden for women to study Talmud or its parts. And this changes later. So my next question was, I guess this is my last question, in what context were these prayers recited? Were they in synagogue services or home rituals? And his answer is synagogue services. And there is demonstration of this in the instructions in the Sidurim. There are very precise notes there. Like after the Shemona Esrei, before the Tachanun, we have a quote that says, and Monday and Thursday, you say Ve'ata and begin Ashrei, and then Uva L'Tzion. So it's clear that these are things that are happening in the synagogue. And also many of them describe the full service of the synagogue, not just the part that women would say. So for example, there's a quote, Ke kiama lo kohen oleye asefer ediche la tehila eres repone lo sefer dice lo musaf. So here calls the Kohen and reads in the Torah and returns the Sefer and says Musaf. So it's clear that this was happening in the synagogue. And also there are prayers for all the holidays, including Pesach, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. Okay, so that was a brief version of what's going on in Judeo-Italian prayer translations. And notice he also referenced the tradition of Judeo-Provençal. We have some examples of Judeo-Provençal prayers on our website. And I recommend that you also look at the Open Siddur Project, one of our co-sponsors today, to get some of the other prayer translation traditions. So now we're going to go a little more into depth into Ladino or Judeo-Spanish. We move to the early modern and modern periods to the Ottoman Empire. And we have with us today linguist Ora Schwarzwald. She is professor emerita at Bar-Ilan University, a researcher of modern Hebrew and Judeo-Spanish or Ladino, especially liturgical texts. Her many leadership roles include member of the Academy of the Hebrew Language, academic correspondent of the Real Academia Española, and president of the Ladino Academy in Israel. So Ora, it seems that there were many prayers in Ladino, more than other languages. And I'm wondering, why do you think that is? And when were they first written? Do you think they were intended for women? And how did they become so widespread in synagogue services? Oh, you have to unmute. There we go.
And can I put the...
Yes, you can share your screen.
Okay. I want to say that liturgy, in my concept, is not necessarily just, I'm sorry about this noise. Liturgy is not necessarily only prayers. It's also the Bible and other texts that people read and used them as part of the services in the synagogue and at home. I have here some recordings of prayers and of Ruth and of other texts. Some of them were mentioned before. Here is, for instance, a tradition of the Salonika community to say Brich Shmei, which is an Aramaic prayer. It is said in Judeo-Spanish in the synagogue just before opening the ark. And here it is. I hope it is. Yeah, okay.
Tú sos que mantienes a todos y gobernas a todos. Tú sos que podés estar sobre lo todo. Tú sos que podés estar sobre los reyes y el reinado tuyo es. Vosotros somos esclavos del Santo.
Okay, I'll stop here and proceed. The Bible was translated into Ladino. The weekly parasha of the Pentateuch was very important. It was said in the synagogue every week, the Haftarah from the prophets, and the Megillot, Shir HaShirim, Ruth, Echa, Kohelet, Esther. Chapters from Tehillim were read, and I had an example from Ruth, but I think we don't have time to listen to it. But it's very interesting because it's they say a verse in Hebrew.
On the festival of Shavuot, which is the Feast of Weeks, in the afternoon at the synagogue, the book of Ruth is read and is chanted in the Hebrew and in Ladino.
ויהי בימי שפוט השופטים, ויירא בארץ, וילך y fue hambre en la tierra, y anduvo varón de Betlehem Yehuda, por morar en cabos de Moab, él y su mujer y dos sus hijos.
In fact, there are translations of the Bible from 1553, from Constantinople in 1547. We have translations of Megillat Shir HaShirim. You can see the Hebrew and the Ladino translations. You can see Ruth, Vayhi B'yimei Shvot HaShoftim, Fue and Dias de, as we heard. Eicha, the same, the Ladino next to the Hebrew. And what happened? Maybe just a minute. And this is from Amsterdam to a translation of Shir HaShirim. The Siddur was translated as early as the 16th century, early 16th century. And we have the Machzor, and the Machzor for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Shalosh Regalim, Ta'aniyot. You can see the printed books. This Siddur Tefillot, we don't know where it was written. It's in a manuscript. It's from the end of the 16th century. But we have Ferrara, 1552, already in the whole prayer book translated. Seder Noshim in 1565, Es Sidur de Mujeres en Ladino para todo el año. And all the prayers are translated. Even Shema Israel is Oye Israel, Adonai nuestro Dios, Adonai uno. Bendito tu nombre de honra de su reino para siempre y siempre. יהי שם כבוד מלכותו לעולם ועד. היא דירה עמידה, והיה כי, sorry, there is instructions how to pray the Amidah and other prayers. And as you can see, there are many, many versions and many, many editions of the prayer books. Enke Elohenu of the Sephardic Portuguese in Montreal. You can see that Hebrew side by side with Ladino. Now, go on.
Called Yirazones.
Yehi Ratzon. Yehi Ratzon is the habit of saying the blessings over
שתתחדש עלינו שנה טובה ומתוקה מראשית השנה ועד אחרית השנה. Sea voluntad de delante de ti, Amonai nuestro Dios y Dios de nuestros padres, que se renove sobre nosotros año bueno y dulce, del principio del año y hasta el cabo.
A very popular and a very famous liturgical poem chanted before the blowing of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah is called Et Sha'arei Ratzon. There will be one stanza sung in Hebrew, and then it is our custom to sing the last few stanzas in Ladino, and the Ladino will be introduced by the word Batayaron.
Et Sha'arei Batayaron en puertas de piedad por abrirlos.
and we go on to other in Machzorim and separate books. Here is a Haggadah Shel Pesach. Already in the Middle Ages, the instructions are in Ladino, but the whole text is in Hebrew. It's from the 13th century. We have more. From 1609, we have the Hebrew text in the middle. You have the translation on the sides in Ladino. It's 1609, and many versions of the Haggadot were published through the years with Ladino translations. And as mentioned earlier, they were sung in the same Seder Noshim. They have Kiddush de Noche de Pesach, Inchira un vaso mediano de vino aguado y dirá. The whole prayers are said in Ladino. And here in the Machzor L'Shalosh Regalim, La Haggadah de Pesach, and we even have from Saloniki in 1970 a version of the Haggadah con Ladino, with Ladino and with Greek translation as well. And the Bulgarian Haggadah from Sofia has the Haggadah in Cyrillic letters, the whole Haggadah in Cyrillic letters, but it is Ladino. I'm going to the Ladino part.
Kadesh, tirando os vasos de vino e dirán Kiddush.
These are the instructions, but there are also translations.
Del principio, servientes, toda Sara eran nuestros padres.
Okay. You see that they have the whole translation of the Haggadah. And just a minute. And Echad Mi Yodea in Ladino, we heard a part, Haggadah, but listen to the
home after the Seder is complete. There are certain traditional songs that are sung in Hebrew. One of those is called Echad Mi Yodea, In Spanish, it's called Que se piense y entendience.
Que so piense y entendience, a la verdad Dios creense, cuál es el único.
No, I don't know.
Okay, or I think we'll stop there if you don't mind.
Okay.
I
Okay.
wish we had time.
I just
all of
want to say that we have the text in Ladino already from the 16th century. There are testimonies of these texts existing, and about this song, אחד מי יודע, quien su piense, apparently it was not connected to the Haggadah shel Pesach at all. It was a song of the Jews in Spain. In the testimonies of the Inquisition, they cite the song, and Quien su piense, as a Jewish song, but not related to the Haggadah at all, just as a comment.
Very
Okay.
interesting. Okay, thank you. Now we are going to stay in the modern period and move back to the Middle East, to Iran. We're turning to anthropologist and musician Galit Dardashti. She is a cultural anthropologist and musician, and currently artist in virtual residence at Indiana University's Jewish Studies program. And she'll be a visiting assistant professor at NYU this fall. Her current book project explores the Mizrahi Piyut phenomenon in contemporary Israel. Dr. Dardashti is also a renowned performer of traditional, original Middle Eastern Jewish music in the US with her projects Divan, The Naming, and Monojat. And she's going to share with us today a recording of her grandfather, and she'll sing a Persian song sung to the groom at the Shabbat service before his wedding. Khalid.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm so excited to be part of this wonderful session. I know we have very little time, so I am exclusively sharing my own family's Persian tradition, and my family lived in Tehran, so I want to be really clear that our traditions may not be representative of all Persian traditions. I like to always mention that. So in my father's Tehrani tradition, there are really not very many songs sung in Persian in ritual prayer at all. But I did know of one that is very close to my heart, which I will tell you about shortly. And I did a little bit of research. I learned one specifically for this session. Thank you to Sarah for asking me to do that, and I will share it for you. So here it is. This first one is Shiraye Dumadi, a song for the groom. And this song would be sung before the groom does his aliyah at the Shabbat Arusi, which is the first Shabbat in a synagogue after the wedding day. And an interesting, a little tidbit about this piece I learned from my father is that you would often have maybe 1 to 3 people singing this piece, and some people would kind of change the verses a little bit on the spot. Perhaps it was because they didn't remember the words, or because they were bringing something innovative to the groom. And it should be sung by somebody with a beautiful voice. But really that's it. Anyone could join in. Of course, it would usually be a man and not a woman. So I'm going to share my screen with you, hopefully successfully. Here we go. Okay, so that you can sort of get a sense of what we're looking at here. The first part of the piece is in Hebrew, and from the Psalms, the second part, the next part, also in Hebrew, I recognize from a very popular piyut, Yismach Chatani, often sung for a groom in many different Middle Eastern Jewish communities. And then it goes to the Persian. So you can follow along, and let me just get my key here. Min hamitzah karatio anani b'machevya lo amut ki achye Yismach atani bikol emunai Yisav racham be'et Adonai Shaddai yemale tabat libo Magen v'simcha yihya berito. His aran shok shodi bar pa residi to bechupa nayofti to java Mione Rome Yisrael Bochori Sodaye Leviathan Nochordito Kule Satan. And that would be improvised. Let me just stop sharing. That would be improvised and sung a bit differently by each person. The next piece I'm going to share is one that I know from my grandfather, Yunus Dardashti. So my grandfather was very well known in Iran in the 1950s and 60s. He sang Persian classical music. And so he sang on the radio, he sang in concert halls throughout Iran in the Shah's palace. But he was also a Jew, of course. And so since there's no professional cantor in most of the Middle East and not Iran, you would basically ask someone to lead who was capable. And since my grandfather was such a great singer, he would often get asked. And in his tradition, we happen to have beautiful recordings of my grandfather chanting the slichot as he would do it when he was asked to. And at the end of it, he always ended slichot with a piece called Monajat. And this was this piece at the end. And when I started looking at it, I asked my family, what is this Monajat piece? It seems to be in Persian. What's the text? And nobody in my family really knew what it was. But the word Monajat means fervent prayer or intimate dialogue with the divine. And so finally, I asked a lot of different scholars. Nobody could recognize the text, but it has many common characteristics to poems written by Rumi. So it was either written by Rumi or someone was modeling, perhaps more likely, their poem after Rumi. So I am going to play a little bit. It's very long, so I'm only playing a short bit of it for you. And I'll say a few more words on it and conclude.
دارم امید که ای بار سحر حاطف دولت ز شب بیداری اگر بیداری الله رو بر خاک بمالم و بگویم یارم یارم توبه کردم من بیچاره ز بد کرداری یا الله.
Okay, so so that was a Monajat, and I guess I'll end with, why did people sing in the vernacular in Iran? And the first example is similar to what Asher and others have spoken about, to help people understand, to be more inclusive and allow more people in. You know, that was a wedding song. This is a big moment. And singing in the vernacular allowed more people to participate, understand what was going on, and be a part of the experience. But for this second piece, Monajat, you know, for many Jews in the Middle East and North Africa, moving between their vernacular languages and Hebrew was more seamless than I think we think of it here, here in the United States, for sure. There wasn't really a clear demarcation between secular and sacred in their worlds. And when I think about the songs that my grandfather was singing in Persian, like the one that you just saw in the text, in classical music, these poems he was interpreting were deeply spiritual songs by Rumi and Hafez. So really defining them as secular doesn't quite capture it. So it seemed completely natural for my grandfather to take some artistic license. And I don't know how common that would be in other traditions. I would love to know if there are other examples in other traditions. But here in this piece, my grandfather was really, this was an expressive piece of his identity as a Jew in Iran. And I'll conclude there. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Galit. That was just beautiful. And it's so great to hear you and your grandfather sing next to each other, because you have such similar beautiful voices and styles. So thank you. Wow, okay, we've learned a lot about the various prayer traditions. And one thing that I've noticed is that there is not really a tradition of translating prayers into Judeo-Persian. And it seems that there's really not that much of a tradition of translating prayers into Judeo-Arabic as well. And so my question for the panelists, and actually let's spotlight all the panelists now, and we'll ask you, I mean, I have one big question, which is, why do you think some languages have a tradition of translating prayers directly and others don't? Does that relate to the inclusion of women? Was it a desire to include women in a way that we don't see in some of the Middle Eastern traditions as much? And well, let's start there, and then I'm sure we'll have other questions. And I'd also welcome any panelists responding to anyone else's words or performances. Ora, it looks like you're talking, but you're muted. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Okay, here. First of all, the two prayer books for women were written in the 16th century, and there was no continuation to it. I mean, these are whole prayer books in Ladino, but there was no continuation. In Yiddish, on the other hand—
Wait, sorry, what do you mean there was no continuation?
They were not printed anymore.
Oh,
they were not printed anymore. It stopped.
It was just a phenomenon of the 16th century.
That's right. That's right. In Yiddish, on the other hand, there were prayer books for women, but actually, as I was told, they were meant for men as well, who didn't know to read Hebrew, who didn't understand Hebrew. So they made it like to be used by women, but men used them as well. And these were full translations of prayer books. As for the regular prayer books in Ladino, not all the prayers were translated after the 16th century. Only parts of the prayer books were translated, not everything. The Haggadah is exceptional. Pirkei Avot is exceptional, but they were always translated. They were very popular. They were translated over and over in various places in different ways. In the prayer books, only parts of them are translated.
Yeah, thank you for distinguishing between the Siddur for Shabbat every day and other holidays versus the Haggadah, because that is an important difference. And there is a tradition in many Jewish communities around the world of translating the Haggadah into their vernacular. Yeah, Ruth,
right.
like you were about to
I was going to say there is at least one manuscript that's been preserved from Spain itself, so a 15th century manuscript of a Ladino prayers, I believe also for women, that I saw. I've seen it. It's not the original, but a publication about it and a transcription of it.
I know you're talking about Lazar's publication. He thought it's a 15th century prayer book for women. He published it, but in fact it was published. I showed a picture of it. It was printed after the expulsion from Spain. It's relatively late.
I will defer to your authority on that.
It was a mistake by him.
Yeah. The other thing is that, as far as I'm aware, the prayer books that are written for women in Yiddish are actually, for the most part, not translations of prayers, but they're Yiddish prayers to be said at the same time in many cases. They aren't, not in many cases, in some cases, in some they're just completely outside of the synagogue experience. So that's something which is operating quite differently. We do have a number of Sidurim and Machzorim that are printed with Yiddish in the in Yiddish translation in the margins. And that's a different phenomenon. I don't think that those translations were actually meant to be used for praying, just because of the way they're laid out. They're in tiny font, and in the margins, it's actually more something to reference. Like we could reference a translation if one's reading, almost like it's printed like a Rashi and a Talmud more than as something that is meant to be easily read. And I've never, so that's much more common as printing becomes a little bit more complex and people start printing for different audiences. They end up putting translations in, and Yiddish is then among the early translations being printed in mainland Europe before they get to translating into European languages directly. So that's a different piece of the phenomenon.
Just a comment on the Siddur for women that I talked about, not the one that Lazar published, the other one. It was meant for women at home, not in the synagogue. Whereas Lazar's prayer, the one he published, Lazar published the prayer book, it was meant for use in the synagogue as well.
Yeah, so thank you. Or actually, Aharon Varadi, who runs the Open Siddur project, just wrote in the chat that tchinis, or tchinot, is the term that encompasses what Dr. Langer is describing, paraliturgical prayers in the vernacular. So, this is something that Asher mentioned before, that there's a fine line, or it's hard to distinguish between liturgy and paraliturgy. And I think, Galit, maybe you were about to say something.
Yeah, I was going to say something related to that, because one piece that we haven't brought up today that I think is really important to actually what you just were starting to talk about with these paraliturgical poems, which are sometimes sung in synagogue and sometimes not sung in synagogue, is the importance, especially in the Arab world, of songs, piyutim, that are composed to songs that exist, right? This is a very, very common practice throughout the Middle East, and especially in the Arab world, people writing these homages basically to these songs. And so there are examples that I actually wanted to bring up today, but I decided to stick with Persian. There's some examples for sure in many songs, but I can just think of a few in the North African tradition where a song that was composed to a very popular, to a pop song, basically, and it became a religious song, let's say, one by Rabbi David Buzaglo. Some of the Arabic was kept in there, so not Judeo-Arabic, but some of the Arabic, Moroccan Arabic was kept in there so that people could sing those parts that made sense as instead of talking to your love, you're speaking to God. And so some of those lines were kept in Arabic. And so that is another reason that I would say, a very important reason that the vernacular was used, because these were very well-known songs, and it allowed people to join in and sing, and the context got changed to the divine, but the song in many, many parts of the piyut stayed intact.
And I just want to add one thing that's particular to the way the Syrian tradition deals with this sort of phenomenon. The Syrian tradition primarily does not incorporate the words from the Arabic song, but they match them phonetically extremely, extremely closely in Hebrew. So, there's the piyut Elad li Laad, comes from Ebat li Jawab or Gawab, I believe. And so you have lots of examples of these piyutim where there's an Arabic song and the poet, the paitan, is really expertly, not necessarily, it's not a calc translation at all. It's not a translation, but it's almost a interlanguage transliteration, basically trying to transliterate the sounds of the Arabic song into sacred Hebrew taking it from what is probably, as Galit said, a love song or something more general, and making it something that is, very much of that sacred liturgy, that paraliturgy. And in our Syrian community, where you do have the Arabic, is on the margins, as I mentioned earlier. So it's not in the synagogue. It's not even really so much for people to understand the liturgy, because it's not really the liturgy. It is pieces on the margins. So the reading of, for instance, the 10 Commandments, a very long translation from the Tafsir Sa'adiyya Gaon, would happen at home on Tu B'Shvat. Or as was mentioned, all of this Pesach liturgy, that's very unusual. So in many communities, you'll have the Haggadah translation, but in the Syrian community, the fact that exists is very strange. You don't see that like what you have for the Slichot, for the Ladino communities. You don't see any of that. It's just sort of on the margins. And in doing this research, I really had to dig, because as a Syrian Jew in America, our community has been here. In some cases, they're members of the community who are fourth generations of, in America. The community began really late 1900s. So there's a lot that has been preserved, but particularly when it comes to Arabic and these things that are not canonized into the synagogue cycle, and they're not sort of halachically mandated things, that stuff kind of fades over time. So I wonder personally if there was much more that existed, say 200 years ago in Syria, that just didn't make the transition to America and other places.
Oh, really interesting. Yeah. And I'm also going to bring in another component here, which is America. We haven't yet talked about this, but there is a very strong tradition of prayer translation into Jewish English. And it tends not to be the literal translations that we see in Ladino, calc word for word, right? But it tends to be more vernacular, but also, especially in the Reform movement, there is a very strong tradition of song leader, where song leaders at Jewish summer camps and youth groups write versions of prayers that incorporate both Hebrew and English. And you get this in, for example, saying like Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, who made me a woman, where it's part in Hebrew, and then the content part of those blessings would be in English. And it's interesting because some people think of this as such a new phenomenon. Oh, this is just American Jews who don't know enough Hebrew to understand the prayers. But really, this has been happening throughout history in various communities. But not all communities, or maybe it did happen in some communities, but we don't have records of them, like you just said, Asher. So anyone else have responses to other people who have been waiting to say them?
I wanted to just name something that's going on in the conversation that I think was worth being named, and that is that we're talking both about melodies from the non-Jewish culture being used with Jewish texts, and Jewish texts, so melodies from the non-Jewish culture being used with Jewish texts, and then Jewish texts being used in the languages, or Jewish texts being expressed in the languages of the surrounding culture. And I'm not quite sure to what extent those are integrated phenomenon, or whether they're really something which is fairly completely separate. There is an enormous amount, even in a community, as I think we're hearing, and there's a lot of examples from Ashkenaz also, of melodies that are adopted and are sacralized, to use the Hasidic terminology for it, by using them for sacred words. I mean, Yankee Doodle, to take an American example, gets used for Adon Olam. But Anim Zmirot is often sung to a Cossack marching tune, things like that. So that's one phenomenon. And then there's the phenomenon of what language one is actually reciting the prayers in. And I grew up actually in the Reform world. That's not where I'm living now so much, but I grew up in the Reform world. My childhood, we learned, I think, four refrains in Hebrew, and everything else was in English in the world in which I grew up. And that was just a given. And so therefore all the music was in English that the congregation was expected to know anyway. that was just a given that the language ought to be something people understand. And that transition back to an almost all Hebrew liturgy, or in many places, has happened in the last 50 years.
In
And
the reform
I can mark it. And that's very much a matter of transliterations in the prayer books, which helps a familiarity with Hebrew, and a culture, the cultural rebirth of Hebrew in Israel, influencing the Jewish world. So there's a lot of different factors shaping dynamism here.
Mm. Yeah.
The dynamics of the music, it happens in all communities in Europe as well as in North Africa and in the Middle East. Moshe Barasher once told Professor Moshe Barasher, the head of the Hebrew Language Academy, told an anecdote. He went to Morocco and he asked the community to sing traditional prayer in the music of their tradition of a certain prayer. And it was some holiday, and they said, okay. And when he heard it, it was Jerusalem of Gold, Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, the Israeli song. The melody was, and they thought this is a really chagigi. How do you say chagigi?
Celebratory.
Festive.
Ceremonial, a kind of ceremonial melody that fits the occasion, which was, of course, just adaptation of a music. And sometimes music researchers show that sometimes some unfit melodies were taken to prayers, and the rabbis were against it because it is a profane, it's a profanation of, it is a profane act to do such a thing.
Like Ruth said at the beginning, it's the not the language of the angels. Yeah. Okay, well, now we're going to bring Mark Kligman on to lead us in Q&A. And everyone in the audience, feel free to add your questions or comments in the Q&A. And while we're waiting for that, we already have Aharon Varadi says that there's an example of a Jewish women's Siddur written in Judeo-Provençal in the 15th century for expulsion on the Open Siddur website, and that has an excerpt from the morning prayers for women. Okay, Mark, take it away.
So thank you all for a really lively panel with just wonderful examples and issues for us to discuss. Some of the questions that have already come in, one to Galit about what date that the recording of your grandfather was made, if you might know.
I think I used to know. I think it was I think it was in the 1970s.
Okay, thank you. And I know that that's even available on YouTube because I know someone that showed it to me. I know it's now become more widely available. So please do provide your questions in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, we'd love to hear whatever questions you might have. Another comment that was made a number of minutes ago by Josh Goldberg that I thought might be interesting for everyone on the panel to comment on is he says, my father-in-law, Reverend Mirza Simozar, would often translate Hebrew prayers, especially on Pesach, into Farsi on the fly, and he was a master. So I know that we're dealing a lot with the written tradition in terms of documents that we see, and as we would say in ethnography or ethnomusicology, you know, what happens in practice may not be what's on the page. And I'm just curious if any of you might have some thoughts or comments on that, because I think it's a wonderful thing that Joel Goldberg brings up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I wanted to bring up, that there are different, even my father told me that piece that I sang today, people would sing different verses and they would come in and I think do things on the fly. And there's a lot of that. Or people just changing some words around. And so when I was actually doing a translation of that piece, I noticed it was different. Like there were some words that were similar to this piyut, but some of the words got changed. So I think that's what, it happens because people change things on the fly, and then that's sometimes what gets recorded. But yeah, I wish we had records of everything that people did on the fly. But I just want to say one more thing, and that is that, and of course, this, Mark, but piyutim in general, I mean, these sacred songs that people brought, to make prayer services more innovative and alive. There are tons of them that people would bring in, and some of them stuck, and they're the ones that stayed in our sidurim or machzorim, and then others that didn't take. They're the ones that kind of we don't have anymore. So I think that happened throughout history.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on that? Asher or Ora, Ruth?
I'd also say there was a lot of variety in liturgical texts, even the ones that were supposedly written down. And it's a fallacy that these texts were completely fixed. You start taking medieval manuscripts and putting them side by side, and you just come up with hundreds of variants. So there's a fundamental orality to liturgy anyway. One receives a tradition, but then one lives with it, and it evolves even within the one generation. And a scribe will write down whatever that scribe happens to think is the correct version, but that's just a received version or a decision between multiple versions that's made at that moment. So this, the idea of making changes on the fly or of generating a translation on the fly is something which is very much part of the tradition of Targum, which A.J. Berkowitz and I were chatting behind the scenes here, and he mentioned that, so I'll give him credit. That the Targum was originally a translation done freely on the fly, and we happen to have a couple versions of it that got written down. But that doesn't mean that that was anything like what the dynamic of translating scripture was in its original into Aramaic, but also into Greek, and eventually into lots of other languages. Again, the congregation I grew up in Pittsburgh, the rabbi was expected when reading Torah to translate it on the fly, not to read it from a printed translation, but to give a live translation of the text. Not necessarily with lots of commentary, but to give that translation. And so that kind of facility is certainly what Hebrew Union College trained its students to be able to do, to translate things readily and freely into the vernacular.
Good, thank you. Ora?
That's how the Ladino translations and the Shach translation were done. It was an oral translation that was written down later. I mean, it's a tradition that started even before, because it's Shnaim Mikra ve'echad Targum, two verses in Hebrew and one in Aramaic have them translated. Shnaim Mikra ve'echad Targum. I just wanted to show you something. May I go back to the presentation, to the don't worry, I'm going to the end. Okay. You see, this is Shirat Hayam Morocco. That's the name of the book. And it says that the Haftarah Lishmini Shel Pesach is from Yeshayahu, from Isaiah, chapter 10, verses 32 to chapter 12, verse 6. And what do we see here? Here, look to the left. הפטרת יום שמיני של פסח בשח ובלדינו. Here we have, to the left, we have the Shach, the Arabic translation from Morocco, and to the right, we have the Ladino translation, word for word. It's not taken from Isaiah, I can assure you. It's not taken from the Haftarah. I looked for the place where it came from, I don't know where, but it is a traditional text, both in Ladino and in Judeo-Arabic, and they are parallel. You can see Sancheriv, Rei Ashur, Sancheriv, Sultan Ashur. It's the same text in both languages, and it's part of liturgy. I don't know if it were ever sung, but it's interesting. We have the Arabic, Judeo-Arabic, and we have the Ladino in Morocco.
Wow, that's just amazing. I think we'd love to put this and all the other resources you've shared on the Jewish language website. And I hope that the Open Siddur project can also include them. We're doing this exhibit jointly, and I'm hoping they'll be able to include that on their site. And then eventually, when volunteers step up, they could include translations of these translations so that people can better understand them.
Yeah, because it's interesting.
Thank you.
I thought it's very interesting.
Asher, is there something you want to comment on this subject of Sharach? Or?
Yeah, I wanted to just basically echo this notion and just emphasize how important it is to really note that there are really no fixed versions of any of these texts until the 20th century, when this stuff just gets published. And so what comes down to us, like for instance in Seattle has republished the Turkish and Greek communities there have republished the Slichot from the early 20th century from Rhodes. But my understanding is that this was one of many translations that were sort of circulating in an oral sense, and that this one was the most cosmopolitan. So it was published both in Romania and it was published in Rhodes. It was written in Latin characters and it was written in Hebrew characters. So this piece had the prestige of publication, and as a result, it's the one that is still with us. Whereas in the Judeo-Arabic world, I have no doubt that there were many of these translations and sort of interpretive translations and whatnot. I know that this exists as an oral tradition, but since we're so removed at this point from that, I don't know, really around World War I is when a lot of this really starts to fall apart. So what we have is something that is an oral tradition that, like many Jewish texts, just get fixed in a certain way. And there are awkward aspects about it. And there are things that just, like artifacts of that process that we can see in these texts. And I think that's just so important to note, that this is just an oral tradition that through basically accidents of history and migration ends up being fixed at a certain point.
To a certain point.
To a certain
point.
If
I can add about the Seattle tradition, they published a wonderful Haggadah Shel Pesach, Passover Haggadah. And the tradition is really the Ottoman Empire tradition. It's somewhere between Salonika and Belgrade. And the interesting thing is to see the end, at the end, אחד מי יודע, quien supiense, that you sang before. Quien supiense. They have two traditions.
Right.
They bring one from Rhodes and the other one from Turkey. And they're different. They're not identical. For instance, in one of them, the three mothers are mentioned with their names. And the other one, only the three are the mothers, two are the fathers, two are Moshe and Aharon. This is also common to the Arabic, Judeo-Arabic tradition.
which I want to say is basically textually the same. They both, Ken Supiense is like Min Ya'lam wa Min Yadri. It follows the same formulation, and the Hebrew does not follow that formulation.
Yeah,
That's
you did
right.
too.
The Hebrew,
Yeah.
Right.
the Hebrew version of the Echad Mi Yodea is not identical to the Ladino version of Echad Mi Yodea, Quien Supiense. Because, for instance, 11, we are used to 11 stars, right? In Hebrew, 11 kochvaya, 11 stars. In that tradition, it's 12 brothers without Yosef, without Joseph. And 12 is 12 brothers with Joseph. And 13 could be bar mitzvah, or when a boy gets to be bar mitzvah, to lay tefillin. So we have various versions of the same song. But
So
as
we have
I
a couple
said,
of other
it's a very old tradition. Yeah.
So a couple other questions, and we don't have really much more time. And one question that came in, I think, was very, very interesting. That's come in that I think, Ruth, you might best be able to answer. Is there a connection between the Catholic move toward a non-Latin language of the particular country? Is there a connection to the way we use language of the country we live in? In Catholicism, it was codified, moved so people, so moved by the Pope. Is that right? Anyway, so I think the question is, maybe in your, I know all the research that you've done with Catholic liturgy, maybe that might be something you can comment on.
Well, the Catholic dynamic is very different in that there's very suddenly with the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, a decree that liturgy ought to be in the vernacular. And there's been some push for it before that, but the official liturgy was and actually still is the Latin text. So there is one fixed Latin text. And then the question and the fights have been over how to translate it and whether it can be translated into a more regional form. I certainly know more about the English translations. There was a whole new translation done in English in the 90s, I think, that was nixed by the Vatican. And then about a decade ago, a replacement for that was put in, which was closer to the Latin and less close to actual English. And so that dynamic, but there you have something very centralized, and we're really talking about something that's very grassroots and not official. There's some official fixing of aspects of the Hebrew liturgy from the medieval period on, basically. Some things before then. But the dynamic that we've been talking about more is something that the fixity seems to come significantly with immigration or expulsions, so that a group of people are expelled from Spain in 1492 and maybe before in 1391 especially too, and they come to a new community and they insist on keeping their own traditions, and they end up shaping the local traditions, but end up with a very strong conservatism about that. And we see that to a certain extent with, for instance, this community in Seattle, which I don't know as much about. The Spanish and Portuguese Jews who ended up in Amsterdam retrieved a tradition that they were told was right to the best of their ability. And then that tradition is spread to all the daughter congregations throughout the New World, especially, but also England. And those communities strive to keep that tradition down to the last note, not just the words, but the melodies. And so there's a lack of openness to assimilation into any new cultures because of this holding on to the traditional customs, the minhag avot, so to speak, to put it back into Hebrew. And so that's a big dynamic in this use of vernacular in the liturgical worlds that is also really, really important to pay attention to.
Thank you. So we see so many really incredibly diverse traditions at play that work in many different ways. I know this conversation can really go on much longer, and I hope we have that opportunity, but we do need to wrap up. But before we end, I want to turn things over to Hannah And again, thank you all very, very much for such a wonderful discussion.
Hey, thank you, Mark. I'm Hannah Pressman, the Director of Education and Engagement for the Jewish Language Project. And on behalf of the HUC-JIR Jewish Language Project, I'd like to thank everyone in the audience for attending today's presentation. Thank you to our sponsors for making this event possible, the UCLA Lowell Milken Center for Music of American Jewish Experience and the Open Siddur Project. And lastly, thank you again to all of the panelists for today's fascinating discussion about multilingual Jewish prayer. This is our final event of the academic year. We've had some fantastic conversations about topics like revitalizing Ladino, documenting endangered languages, Jewish Wordle, and languages of the Jews of Iran. Part of the Jewish Language Project's core mission is to regularly convene experts across disciplines, as well as speakers and heritage learners, to share their findings and thereby raise awareness of Jewish languages, both their rich history and their current precariousness. We provide these events to the public free of charge so that all can come and learn. I'm happy to announce that we do have one event scheduled for the summer. On Sunday, July 17th at 10 a.m. Pacific, Sarah Bunin-Benor will host a conversation with Jeffrey Chandler of Rutgers University. His new book, Yiddish Biography of a Language, presents the story of the defining vernacular of Ashkenazi Jews from its origins to the present. I'm personally looking forward to this event because Professor Chandler's research impacted the way that I explored Yiddish land, as it's known, when I began to study Mama Loshen 20 years ago. So again, that's Yiddish Biography of a Language coming up on July 17th. You can register for the Zoom link and watch recordings of many of our past panels at jewishlanguages.org/events. While you're on our website, I encourage you to check out the Jewish English Lexicon, one of our flagship projects, which recently relaunched with new features. The lexicon now has over 1,700 entries, hundreds of which can't be found in any Jewish language dictionary. We are really proud of this crowdsourced research project, and we encourage you to participate or volunteer if you can. Also, if you're not already following us on social media, find us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. We post fun facts twice a week, and there is great content lined up for the upcoming holiday of Shavuot, as well as some amazing material from the Cairo Geniza. You can also subscribe to the Jewish Language Project's YouTube channel for event recordings and other interesting material. The best way to keep up with everything we have going on is to subscribe to our email list for occasional updates about events, programming, and research initiatives. Lastly, the Jewish Language Project is a nonprofit organization, and we rely on your support to keep our initiatives going. This is critical, time-sensitive work in the field of documenting languages. And if you believe in this mission, we'd love to have your support. Sarah's going to drop 2 links in the chat, one that connects to the Jewish English Lexicon, and the other to contribute to our current documentation project on Iranian Jewish languages. You can also find the donation button on our homepage and on our email newsletters. Thank you for supporting these initiatives and ensuring that future generations will be able to study this precious linguistic heritage. Here at the Jewish Language Project, we believe that there is a world of history in every Jewish language, and each speaker has something to teach us. Thank you again for joining us for today's program on multilingual Jewish prayer. To all those who will be celebrating Shavuot next week, Chag Sameach. Take care, everyone, and we hope to see you soon.